Good morning, everybody, from my side. So good seeing so many motivated faces here. I'm very pleased, and it's a great pleasure and honor to me to chair this panel, the last one, before the break, which is entitled Sustainable Cities and Climate Change, Building Resilience and the New Urban Nexus. I'm very honored to be here with Professor Nadim Verjala, Professor Yasser Abu Nasser, and Raouf Dabas. After the presentation of the IPCC report few days ago, Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, said, "Science has spoken. There's no ambiguity in the message." He described this report as a historic report. And in chapter 8 of the report, which deals with the effects of climate change on our urban cities, we can read these main findings. First, much of key and emerging global climate risks are concentrated in urban areas. Second, action in urban centers is essential to successful global climate change adaptation. And third, cities are composed of complex interdependent systems that can be leveraged to support climate change adaptation via effective city governments supported by cooperative multi-level governance. Already the term complex interdependent systems, as which cities are described, leads us directly to the concept and the approach of urban nexus. The leading question of this session will be, how can the urban nexus approach help us to effectively tackle these challenges presented in the IPCC report? I don't want to go into the detail of the panel. I think we'll have 3 excellent presentations. I just want to present first our first speaker, Professor Nadim Verjala. He's an associate professor of environmental hydrology at the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences and the Faculty Research Director of the Climate Change and Environment in the Arab World Program here at AUB. His research focus is on climate change and policy development with special emphasis on the water sector. His most recent work addresses the application of the water energy food nexus approach to adaptation and resilience building on a variety of scales ranging from the farm to national and regional levels in both the urban and rural context. Since you've done lots of research in the field on the nexus on water, energy and food, my question is very simple. How can this new approach or the approach of the urban nexus help in building resilience and more sustainable cities? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope to answer this question. Thank you, everybody. I will start out a little bit with some definitions that I'm sure my colleague Yasser Abu Nasser would be going much more in depth with, but I just want to lay the background for what my talk is going to lead to. If you look at the definition of resilience, and you can see it in many different contexts, in many different places, the 2 that I picked out were the resilience is the capacity of a system, and we'll talk a little bit about the system later, to absorb disturbance and reorganize while undergoing change so as to still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedback. So the interaction stays the same. It is not diminished by any stretch. It is also the capacity of a system. It's also supporting the system to withstand shocks and to rebuild in response to change, including any unanticipated change. So we have an anticipated change, which is the changing climate, but then we also have typhoons, hurricanes, droughts, etc., disasters that occur, and the resilience of a system is how it can respond afterwards. Then we come to the definition of sustainability, and there you go into 1,000,001 definition. I picked out just 3. And the first one is the most common one. It's meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future to meet its own needs. Also, it's the improvement of human life, the quality of human life, while living within the Earth's carrying capacity. And the Earth's carrying capacity is not restricted to us as humans, it's to all living organisms. And finally, the third one that I picked out is the stabilizing the relationship between human culture and the living world. So the living world being anything, the human culture being our ability to occupy an area, develop it, and sort of bend nature to meet our needs. And then everything outside that realm is living world, if you will. But there is some living world within. So, in my opinion, resilience does feed into sustainability because the capacity, if you build up the capacity of a system to withstand any shock, then over a long period of time, if your system is not resilient, it's not sustainable. The minute you get a shock, it's going to go away. So this is where I'm starting at. And the system that I've been talking about, and I'm putting in just the three basic, and I'm inserting one inside. The governance system, I didn't know, it's maybe it's the social system rather than the governance system. It's how society is built up, and especially I'm focusing on an urban setting. It's how the society is set up. What kind of governance or government system does it work with? Is it a democracy, a dictatorship? And we've seen how these have reacted to different shocks throughout our existence. And there's the presence or absence of institutional frameworks that can help manage these shocks and these adaptations, if you will, and the economic system that allows people the flexibility and the resilience, if you will, once the shock is absorbed, how to rebound from that. But to help this system, this soft system, let's say, you need the physical infrastructure. And that, if you break it really down to its basics, other than the buildings, you're looking at the wet utilities, water, sewage, stormwater, drainage, all the wet aspects, and then you've got the dry aspects, electricity, power supply, telephone, all sorts of connecting communication systems that exist, plus roads. So I've excluded the buildings from the physical infrastructure in this description, but they are the cores to which we provide these utilities. So they are there for us to serve. And then within the urban setting, even that, we have natural systems. We have parks, large and small, and we have rivers that run through these urban settings, and these in and of themselves develop their own natural system. So this is a background that I'm laying down to reach to my case study that I'll be presenting. We're looking at the role of water, energy, and food, the nexus. This is something that is very hip nowadays. Everybody likes to talk about it, the nexus approach, the nexus approach. It's been around for ages, if you think about it truly, but it is something that is now people are more focusing in on. Basically, we want to secure our water supply, we want to secure our food supply, we want to secure our energy supply. And this nexus approach doesn't focus on one, it focuses on all three being together, looking at them as a unit or a system, whereas if you favor one, you might lose the other. So you approach it in a sort of a holistic, another nice term that people love, holistic approach. But at the core of this, in most societies and communities and systems, is the availability of water resources. So what you have is on this balance that we're trying to create, we have the threat or the stress of urbanization, the stress of population growth, and now the ever-growing threat of climate change. And with this, society now we know has more access to information. They have the lower levels of society, if you will. Now even the lower educated classes or levels have access to information. So we're building and connecting the bottom of the pyramid. Economies now are growing and they're producing much more with less. And there is a need and there is a growing market to invest in and sustain ecosystem services. With all this, with this being one push and then the stresses coming in, you have to have the enabling factors and incentives within a governance system. Excuse me. So at the end of this cycle, what we would come out with is water, energy, and food security for all society, all parts of society, and where it is water, energy, and food are equitably distributed and in a sustainable manner that is growing. And the society which does this would end up being a resilient and a productive environment. So this is just the general picture. And summing it up, basically, the Nexus approach is to optimize the association between water security, energy security, and food security. We want to do the best with what we have and make sure that it is all on an even keel. Sometimes when we look at this application in an urban setting, you would think water resources in a city like Beirut, we use water, we don't produce water. Or we use energy rather than producing energy. We consume food rather than produce food. So it is very easy for us when we start looking at the nexus. Sometimes we can point out in terms of energy security, well, if we want to ensure energy security for a city, we produce more power, more electricity. We need water security, we tap more resources, increase the supply, build a dam here or a dam there, drill a well or whatever. And then people have a little bit more difficulty looking at the energy security when you tell them, well, you could decrease consumption or you diversify your sources for this, in terms of energy and water. And it is extremely difficult for people to realize, though, that when we address food security in an urban setting, it is not the production aspect strictly, but it is that where we can promote less consumption, less waste, and there are numbers that are scary about how much GCC countries throw away in terms of food stuff as a percentage of what they get. And we could then, after we address these, we could look at producing locally in a city. So my background being a hydrologist, and I'm working a lot on climate change and all that, I'm going to focus my perspective, if you will. I'm looking at the perspective from a climate change, but this is an all-encompassing approach. We can look at the MENA region, and we look at what the changing climate is going to be doing to the MENA region. We're going to have less water, and it's going to be a larger stressor. Temperatures are going to be higher, and severe weather, whether in terms of rain events or droughts, is going to be more frequent and stronger. Just moving before I do that, what would a changing climate do to our setting, to an urban setting? These are just some thoughts on what would happen, the key impacts. There will be a disruption of water and food, probably also energy. There will be a definite reduction in air quality, a reduction in water quality. There will be infrastructure failure. And when we talk about water quality, by the way, we're going to talk about surface and subsurface, groundwater. Infrastructure failures are going to be common, and stress on public health is going to be tremendous, especially in the occurrence of and prevalence of vector-borne diseases, mosquitoes and rodents, etc. And then with all this, there's going to be a stress on social services, increase in internal migrations, and cities are going to be the center of attraction for all those failed systems in rural societies. So they're going to be coming to a city. The growth of poverty belts or poor areas is going to be prevalent. And then associated unemployment, and then think about school days and how we are suffering from this already in Lebanon, where we have an influx of Syrian refugees, and we need to stagger the school days to meet the demands of schooling for these kids. Just some pictures from the area within the last few years about what's the flooding. That's just the severe storms. We've got in 2013 here in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia, imagine, and 2000 and 2001 in Algeria and Lebanon, and this is in Egypt. Two of those countries, only two, are more or less rich with water as precipitation water, and that's Lebanon and to some extent Algeria. The rest are dry. So, I want to approach the case study of Beirut. I mean, being a local person, I would like to share with you what my thinking is on the Nexus approach and how it can be applied, and in a very narrow aspect. In a study that I had conducted over 4 years ago, we found out that the minimum temperature in Beirut has increased since 1874 till 2003 by 3 degrees Celsius, whereas the maximum temperature has not increased in a statistically significant manner. This is the minimum temperature up here on your upper left-hand corner, but the important part, and I'm circling it now, is you could correlate the increase in temperature to a great extent with the increase in urban areas. And then you come to the density issue, and that's even going to be worse. We're just looking at the areal extent. And of the 3 degrees increase that we have witnessed, we could explain about 2 degrees due to your urban heat island effect. So there is an issue here as a background. So we look at Beirut. This is how Beirut looks right now, and you can see, I'll show you another picture courtesy of Yasser. Beirut, if you look at the most recent large-scale development that has occurred, it's the yellow one. Does it show yellow? Yes. So it's the yellow one here. That's the central district. This area here is the Hippodrome and Hirsch Beirut. That's the green part. And the triangle here is the nearest fringe of peri-urban agriculture. That's along Nahar Beirut. And the blue line here is Nahar Beirut until just after Jisr al-Basha. The 2 areas I circled are the areas that are currently undergoing the largest rate of development. So I want you to keep these in mind. And I don't have a zoom in on this, but you could clearly see that there is a very distinct lack of any greenery. So what we propose to do, and we will be researching this hopefully and getting some numbers, is in implementing the Nexus. And the 3 legs of the Nexus, or the 3 nodes of the Nexus, whichever you want to look at it. First, in water. What can we do with water? We can harvest rainwater on roads and on roofs. And then within that, we can recycle and reuse that wastewater. So a city then does become a generator or a resource producer. So we do have a resource to produce and to manage. On the energy level, we can install green roofs to reduce loss of energy and use whatever water we trap on surfaces, on the roofs, to generate for micropower generation. And then we can install solar and wind power generation. With respect to food, we can go with rooftop gardens, we can go with community gardens, and then we can go with vertical agriculture. Basically buildings where you, at each level, plant something. These are just pictures of rooftops, vertical gardens, community gardens, and in an urban setting. So what can happen with water when we introduce water? One, instead of only being a source of water to store, when we put in, and the common theme, what I want to point out, the common theme amongst all these 3 is the rooftop garden. So if we focus on that, we can see that a rooftop garden, in addition to being a source where we can harvest rainwater, it will be a source where we can attenuate the peak of rainfall so that we can go shrink our drainage systems locally. And we can, at the same time, bring in condensates from air conditioning to irrigate our gardens. In terms of energy, I don't have a number for Beirut. The most common application of green rooftops is in Europe, where it's more or less temperate. When we bring it over to this part of the world, we need still to identify the exact or a range of values for heat loss control. And we could see by this figure how much of a heat that we can keep in. And that would reduce our energy bill for cooling. And then in winter as well for heating. We can produce our own food. and it is producible. And when you produce your own food and you bring people in on rooftops as well as in gardens, you generate a better community. And when you get a better community sense, people tend to support each other, and then you become more resilient. And then something that Nicholas yesterday mentioned, within a city, you should and you could have a biodiversity, and then you create by rooftop gardens and even gardens on the ground. You can create corridors and habitats for migrating birds and to move through. I have just these two pictures to show you. This is the green area within Beirut, with the small green, dark green dots being the trees. So you can see how dispersed the green areas are. If we look at the green developments that we have and we look at the arrows that we can come up with, we can provide these corridors for mainly migrating birds to go through and access natural conditions. So, finally, the nexus approach that I described is for a city that has water, basically as precipitate. That's at its core. It works. And we just need to put in the numbers on that. What we don't have in many MENA cities is that water availability at the core of the nexus. We can focus on the energy food aspect, but still water can come through. And I just want to look at in MENA, in other MENA cities where water is poor, is we can focus on varying power sources. We can generate power from those new sources to treat and recycle wastewater, and we're using condensates as well as an addition, generate enough water, produce enough water to irrigate limited green areas that we have. It is doable, it is not undoable. Hopefully within next year, if we meet again, we will give you numbers on what we're doing. We're hopefully launching this couple of research projects on this. Thank you.
Thank you for your interesting presentation, and especially for being like exactly in time, 20 minutes. I would now invite you to join us here on the panel. And Abu Nasser is assistant professor of landscape architecture and planning at the American University of Beirut. His research emphasis is on policy and planning for climate adaptation in urban regions, and his current focus is on the development of contextuality viable ecosystems-based adaptation approaches within the MENA region. His work also addresses developing planning procedures that address uncertainty in the decision-making process. So my question to you is quite simple. So first, what is the concept of resilience you wanted to focus a bit, and then what is the connection and how is the relation between sustainability and resilience? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Obviously, resilience has been a big buzzword these days, like sustainability. And I would like to start off by talking a little bit where this word comes from. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar, but it simply comes from the science of ecology. And it's been a word, and the concepts that we use today in applying on urban contexts have been around for the past at least 30, 40 years. But obviously, we're just waking up to some reality that, ecology can be of some benefit to us. So when looking, and I'm not going to repeat the definition, it's very similar to what Dr. Farajallah has mentioned, but I would like also to add to that there's a lot of research that's happening on social ecological systems. And social ecological systems are systems where people and the land or their ecosystems actually work together. So if you look at ecology, ecology is the study of organisms with their ecosystem or with their surrounding. And social ecological systems are simply systems where people and the land or these ecosystems work together. And what comes out of this are a couple of words that I'm going to read right now, and I will connect them to the urban context later on. Resilience is very much about a systems approach. There's a lot about what we talk about in adaptive capacity. There's something what we call redundancy, and when we come and look at cities about redundancy, why do we need redundancy? But we'll look at that. Then adaptability, the idea of panarchy, nested hierarchies or nested scales, and then transformability. I know these are big words, very theoretical. I'll try and make them more meaningful as we move forward. So why are we looking at cities? Why are we trying to look at cities from an ecological perspective? That's the bottom line of what we're trying to do here. There is urban expansion, that's for sure. I mean, there are projections, at least in the MENA region, like trends all over the world, at least in the developing countries. There's high urban expansion paralleled with population growth. There's increased resource extraction. At the end of it, increasing pollution and land consumption. So if we look at our cities, I'm just going to run 4 pictures, and if you observe, those photos, cities have no limits, have no boundaries anymore. They extract the surrounding, they extend into the rural areas, they obliterate, they move, we just suck out everything. And in many ways, we need to do so. We need to survive, we need to live. And this is where we need to be careful. There are disturbances, and if you look at the map of the MENA region, most of our cities, like any traditional cities, either are on the waterfront or near a water body, which put them in a very, very vulnerable situation. As Dr. Farajallah also mentioned, the impacts are high, and I'm not going to limit it to climate change only, with the rising sea level, coastal subsidence, increasing in temperatures, and, changing weather regimes. But, away from all of that, there's also, even if climate change doesn't happen, there's definitely water scarcity regardless of what we say. There are earthquakes that might happen. There's loss of arable land because of change of economies and culture. There's also the big issue of insecurity. These are all disturbances that cities need to be ready to address and be able to accommodate. Again, very similar pictures. The funny part is that we always show water, but I think when we talk about Dubai, where it rains 3-4 times a year, that's the only visual that we can show. But when we look at desertification, the lack of the presence of open space or natural systems, it becomes a little disturbing to think that we really need to look at this in a more detailed approach. When we look at resilient cities and we say a systems approach, what does that mean? As also Dr. Farajallah said, there's the governance, the physical, and the natural. We've been until now looking at each sector independently, and what is important here is to try and connect these, to look at dependencies and look at across sectors. There's also the adaptive capacity, which connects to vulnerability. Adaptive capacity is the capacity of any system, in this case it's our cities, to be able to respond to a certain situation. And there's also the extent of vulnerability or vulnerability assessment. How weak are we? And the adaptive capacity says, how much can we actually address that weakness? So and at this level, it's not only physical, it's also social, it's also about governance, and it's also about infrastructure. Resilient cities also look at redundancy, and redundancy in natural systems, when a big flood comes into a forest, kills half of the trees, you still have more trees to put in the seedlings and to get the forest going all over again. And in urban systems, this idea, the redundancy idea, needs to be actually reinterpreted. I don't think we can have 3 highways running parallel to each other. But we could, if we actually look at the regional scale, and we try and look at different possibilities. If you look at governance also, or municipalities, the centrality versus decentrality, and trying to look at complementarities between all these cases becomes very, very important. Adaptability in this sense is also flexibility and being able to address uncertainty. Core to this issue is that we never know uncertainty. We never know what's going to happen in the future. But I think here the problem, especially with climate change, we know it's going to happen, but we don't know really the magnitude. We know a range, okay? And with that, this becomes really problematic because policymakers, like any policymaker around the world, he or she need to know how much money they need to spend. They are thinking of their next election, in democratic societies. But At the end of the day, we need to deal with that uncertainty one way or another. And that's something that we need to incorporate in the way we define policy, in the way we define planning. As I mentioned also, the multiple scales. It's not sufficient anymore to look at cities at the urban core or at the site scale. We need to look beyond that because cities have physically grown beyond that. They connect socially, culturally, physically, food, as we are talking, energy beyond the limits of any city. So the impact of resilience, or the impact of how do we actually become resilient or more adaptive, has to be connected to the larger scale. The last point that I want to mention is transformability, is the sense that we need to also know that is it too late to go back and rebound, as we are saying. If you are in a shock situation, can you really go back to that original state? Or if you cannot go back to the original state, how will you transform, and how will you embrace change as part of the way you actually create your policy or the way we develop our cities? Now, connecting back to the theme of the conference here, when we say resilient is not necessarily sustainable. And there's a big confusion about the replacement of the word resiliency with sustainability. Recently, last May, I was in New York attending a workshop, and I did a field visit with some colleagues on the impacts of Sandy. And we looked at the different levels of measures that are being taken. And ideas like putting in seawalls and to prevent rise or storm surges. It might work for the next 5, 10 years or 15 years, but if you start looking at the communities there and the way they work, that's not a very sustainable solution. That might affect even the societies on the coast, their livelihood, and so forth. But if you look at the definition of sustainability, the bottom line is that we need to manage resources in a way that guarantees welfare and promotes equity of current and future generations. I know it's a bit generic, but if we look at, and I'm not going to delve more into that discussion because I think every one of us may have a totally different definition, but the bottom line are the 3 E's: equity, environment, and economy. So when looking at both definitions, when we look at the city under the definition of sustainability, the city is a culprit here. The city is extracting, the city is taking, the city is changing. And when we're looking at resilience, the city is a victim, basically. But the funny part is that they both all connect, that solutions need to come from and within the city. So in many ways, resilience should lead to some sustainable level and to some sustainable futures. And I agree here with Dr. Farajallah that resilience should be part of, let's put it this way, sustainability is the ultimate vision, and resilience is more of a sub-part of that adds another layer, another level to our sustainable thinking. But there are also misconceptions and disconnections. If you look at density, green infrastructure, corruption, dikes and dams, as I just mentioned. But for example, look at corruption. Corruption is something that we don't want to see in our future sustainable city, but it's a very, very resilient system. We try and remove it, it comes back. We remove it, it comes back. Okay? So I think the point here is that we really need to look at both in tandem and try and take the best of both and come up with one idea. We look at the physical structure, and excuse me for the lousy quality of the photo, but if we also look at density, sustainability calls for density, and we've heard that in the transportation presentation earlier today. But also, what does density mean? Yes, it brings, you get an economy of scale for transportation, your infrastructure is more efficient and so forth, but at the same time, it puts your population under high levels of vulnerability. If there is a big shock, a big, disaster that happens, you have more people that are being hit. So basically what I'm trying to say here is I'm not saying that density is not good, but also we need to look at different aspects of density and try and incorporate certain measures that makes a certain level or quantity of density that is manageable, that is resilient. The same story with green infrastructure. I think we love the color green, and this is not from the Middle East, but there's always this impression we want everything to look green, and green infrastructure, and that's one of my area of research also, is being put as a one aspect, one physical measure that can actually make cities more resilient. But if we come and look at our MENA, our region, as again Dr. Farajallah mentioned, this is based on water. The bottom line is water, and we're definitely into water scarcity situation. How do we look at that? How can we reinvent green infrastructure in a way where it becomes more contextualized, more adaptable to our situation? So, as a conclusion to this sustainable resilience idea connection, imagine a graph where we want to reach a resilient and sustainable future. Resilience allows us to adapt once maybe for a city, but if we think of sustainable resilience, that allows us to be able to adapt to different risks or different disturbances several times and still continue to be able to function and survive. And the trick here and the way the projections are going, it's not that the disturbance is going to happen, in 20 years is going to be the same as today. It's actually going to be of a higher magnitude and maybe of a higher frequency. So our preparedness is not simply about putting some systems in place, but it's also working all the time to keep that going at any, and developing it and increasing. How much time? So how do we become resilient? Looking at cities, we hear of sustainable planning, and what comes from resiliency is adaptive planning, adaptive systems planning. And there are already, a lot of literature on that, a lot of application. If you look at a lot of cities, a lot of states in the US, primarily California, Florida, New York, they've all been, working on adaptation. Australia is very ahead in adaptation, especially they have the same issue of water scarcity that we have. A lot of European countries are also advancing with that. And there is some level of consensus of how to move forward. And this has gone beyond simple disaster mitigation or disaster response, because until now, and a lot of what is defined as adaptation is simply a response to a risk. And this is not what is intended here. The intention here is to move forward with the sustainable resilience, if you want to call it. So simply, it's about developing an adaptation plan, which plans at the regional scale, but implements at the local scale. It's very important to ask ourselves, what are we adapting to, and whom are we adapting, and who is adapting actually? Because, I'm generalizing here a little bit about the Arab region or the MENA region, but again, every single city in the MENA region has its own context and its own specifics. So it is very important to identify the threats and identify the vulnerabilities in that context. There are also impact of policies, and there are certain sets of policies that come out. There's what we call the no regrets policies, in the sense that if we implement these policies today, in 20 years, even if climate change doesn't happen or the impacts are not as severe as we think they were, they are, they're going to do something good to the city. There are incremental policies that build up as we move forward. There are transformative policies that actually change the whole system. And this is where the fear comes in with the transformative policies. If we look, again, I'll go back to the New York idea. There was some talk in the sense, in that context, like the no regrets policies are simply policies putting in sand dunes to put back the sea level rise. Incremental policies begin putting in more engineered solutions because the sea is rising faster and so forth. But transformative policies are basically retreats where people are actually moved away from the shoreline. But here it becomes completely complex. As we have here in Lebanon, private ownership is like God sent in the US. So how do you deal with compensation of land ownership, land value, and so forth? And it becomes completely complex in that system. It's very much also indicator-based. A lot of what we try and do is trying to also monitor these disturbances and trying to work with them. As I've mentioned before, there's also adaptive capacity that needs to be increased in that sense. I've been told I have 3 more minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through this. This is a typical adaptive planning process that's been used recently in the California Emergency Management Agency. But what's interesting about this is that you could easily go identify the climate exposure, impact, adaptive capacity, risk, and you prioritize and so forth. But if you look at the dotted line, and this is where it becomes a little different, is what we call the feedback loops. And what is important about this is that we cannot simply just put a plan and let it roll. We need to continue monitoring. We need to continue looking at it. What does that mean? It means that municipalities, agencies need to have research bodies connect to science, to climate science, to planning, which turns the whole process into a completely multidisciplinary system. This is some work that we've been doing, looking at adaptation plans and trying to bring in the idea of different scales of policies and looking at feedback loops. I'm not going to dwell on that very much, but I would like to discuss this before I go to my last slide. This is from the Copenhagen Adaptation Plan. And what's really interesting about this is that if you look at your left side, you've got the geographic scale from region to building. And on the upper row, you've got the different objectives for adaptation. The first one is the reduction of the likelihood of a certain situation. The second one, reduce the scale, and then reduce vulnerability. I'm just going to go very quickly with one example across this. So if Copenhagen is very much vulnerable to high surges and high sea level. So at the larger scale, at the regional scale, what you can do is create a lot of basins that can collect the water. If you actually go down to the building level, all right, there are also measures that actually can reduce the amount of the overall water connection across the whole system. What this is basically telling us is that systems, or at least the impacts of any event, don't know boundaries, which means that across these scales, it means different political or governance bodies need to cooperate and work together at one level. And if you go horizontally across the table, so you're reducing the likelihood, so you're reducing the possibility of this happening, so you're reducing the amount of water. Then the second one, you would have also reduced the scale, which means reduce the scale of the impact by being prepared, and then reducing the vulnerability is the protection of infrastructure. So what this is telling us is that there are measures at different levels, at the physical level, at the natural system level, and at the municipal level. So what does this all mean? I know we know our context in the MENA cities. All what I've been talking about requires already systems in place, requires a lot of financial resources, requires less corruption, requires understanding or believing in the public good one way or another. But we really need to, at one point, start addressing all of this. And I'm not going to list all of these points, but you can take a minute and read them. They summarize a lot of what I've been talking about. But anyway, this is a call of action in the sense that we cannot just sit and watch, basically. We need to do something. And at this point, it is completely important to look at the region as a region. That's important also, but also at the same time, trying to look at different cities and different areas to try and identify specific risks that are potentially going to happen. Thank you. No, perfectly fine.
Well, thank you for this very interesting presentation, and thank you for this call for action. And talking about action, now we have an activist, or someone who is like not only an activist but also advisor. So he has like two perspectives: the perspective of an activist and the perspective of someone who is, since, if I'm not mistaken, since 2007 till present, senior advisor to the Minister of Environment in Jordan. Since 1994, you are active in for environmental NGOs in Jordan. You've created several of them, and you're vice president of the federation, the newly created Federation of Environmental NGOs in Jordan. So, floor is yours. And well, you just asked me to say that you have done and worked a lot about green economy and how green economy is important, maybe to make cities more resilient.
let me just start out by saying I didn't start out. I didn't study environment. I kind of grew into environment because to start out with, about 30 years ago, I was hunting. I was a hunter in the deserts of Jordan, going out and looking for all types of wildlife. It was fun time back then because you can drive out to the desert and just basically stay there for a couple of nights and come back with geese and ducks, and there were lots of animals back then. And then when I graduated, cut a long story short, came back to Jordan, went back out there, and there was nothing left. You know, it was just absolutely lots of highways and farms and houses, and I was going, what the hell happened? How can they allow something like this, so natural, to be destroyed so easily, just in less than a decade? And so I began to look around and finding out answers, and there were no one giving me answers back then. There was about 3 NGOs back then in Jordan. And so I decided to start something with youth, and I started up the very first NGO in 1994 called the Friends of the Environment Society, the 4th NGO in Jordan. And we began to train and educate and awareness and all that. And I remember going back and forth to industries and trying to convince them, and you have to change this and you have to do that. And it didn't work. It didn't work because we've missed something. Environmentalists have missed something very serious. They've missed the point. We were running after, we were called tree huggers, you know. We'd really, I've stopped them from cutting down forests and things like that, and we missed the point. We've stopped them from hunting the whale sharks in Jordan and the Red Sea, and we've missed the point. We missed the point, not only on the local level, but even internationally. Why? You know, the world forums are trying to convince governments that their emissions must be below 1995 emissions so that we can protect Earth from a catastrophic growth or increase in temperatures beyond 2 degrees. And you know something? It's already happened. It's already happened. It's already happened because in a country such as Jordan, we have a study out that came out. It's called the Third National Communication for the Climate Change. And it says that Jordan's precipitation has actually decreased by 20%, increased temperatures by 2 degrees. And this is something we've been worried about. For the past 50 years, we've been telling people that this is going to happen, and don't, you know, this is dangerous. And every time we talked about the environment, everyone would shut the doors and say, these hippies are looking, look what they're doing. And the word that you said was so relevant, because you said that the vector of contagious diseases would be moving north and south of the equator, and you know, more severe flooding and more frequent and severe natural disasters would take place. And no one believed us. No one believed us. And it's our fault, because we didn't speak the language that was creating this machine of change or this progress. And look at this map behind me. This is a study out by AFED, and exactly, again, was mentioned by my predecessor speaker here. We are vulnerable, guys. We are going to be susceptible for any changes in sea level, because all of our major cities are located on the coastline, and those red and yellow spots there are identifying those countries that are already under threat from many of these issues dealing with sea level rises. And I always said this. This is something I used to give back in 1990s, saying there's something going to come up, it's going to cause the quadruple squeeze, and everyone was saying, what the hell is that? And I'm going, you know, there's going to be a time where the population growth, demographics of this world that we live in is going to be greater than what it can sustain. And then maybe even the climate change would be something different, and maybe, you know, the types of weather patterns that we're so used to might be also changing. Then the ecosystems would be collapsing here and there. And then there's going to be a surprise thing that comes out, no one knows what that is. How are we going to deal with this? What resilience can a planet of ours handle without it falling apart? And you know, that's what's happening. We have flooding in areas that never saw flooding before. We got forest fires and changes in weather patterns. We got congestion. We got, you know, everything that we've feared happened. Everything. Don't fool yourselves. I'm an environmentalist. We we have passed the tipping point. I tell you, we have. I mean, even the tundras that we are in the frozen tundras of Russia, those are thawing out, and the impacts of that on the atmosphere with all the methane escape, that's just unbelievable. Now, looking at it from an Arab context, I'm going to zoom in a little here, and they say the severe water complexities of water scarcity would be really hitting us hard in 2025, and that's just tomorrow. That's not too much time. 95 million people across the region, lack access to proper sanitation, land degradation, all these stuff that you've been hearing throughout the past 2 days. And I couldn't agree more with the gentlemen that were speaking just before me. And I'm going, there has to be a way out of this. Temperature increasing all along. I don't want to go through all this because it's happening as we speak, and we need to find the solutions. And then I think, why did we fail? How can you speak English to a Chinese that doesn't speak English? Or how can a Chinese speak to an English-speaking person without knowing Chinese? We weren't speaking the same language. And what we needed to develop in 1990, end of 90s, beginning actually 2005, is when this new clique came about, and they're talking about a green economy. All right, that's great. So let's try to integrate into this machine that's happening, some green movements, green developments. And so I don't want to dwell on Jordan too much, but the idea is that Jordan is a great example, and so is Lebanon and other small little countries with high demand and very low sustainabilities. We're one of the 3 poorest world countries in water. 95, if not 99% of our energy comes from outside the country. It subsidized about the quarter of our population of our GDP is subsidizing the fuels. And then I say, all right, what's the solution? We need to work together. There's no way about it. Green economy needs to be the solution, but for a green economy to work, there needs to be the 3 major segments of our society working together. The international agencies from outside, when they come in, they want to look at easy gain, and so they go directly to the government and say, we want this implemented. Unless there is more access with the private sector, these things will not happen. And so we need to always, I can't overemphasize the need for a private sector to integrate. And so we come up with different definitions of green economy. Whatever you want to call it, you can call what you want. Some people call it green economy, some people call it green growth. It doesn't matter what we call it, as long as we have an economy that integrates the concepts of sustainable and green integration. And there are different countries. There's not one size fits all. These are the list of sectors. What we've done in Jordan, we've chosen the least access, the lowest lying fruit. And so agriculture, definitely, because of the food nexus, it's very important. Energy, and then there's water. You see, those 3 are always going to be the same in most of the countries. But then you add to that tourism, transportation, and waste, and you can start looking at a very easy way of going forward. And why are we talking about water, energy, and food? Because 90%, or sorry, more than 50% of the global communities are living in cities. And this nighttime satellite image of the planet shows that, yes, there are huge amounts of people moving into cities. So that's why working with cities becomes so much more advantageous. You don't have to run after the mitigation and adaptation projects all the way out to the rural communities. If we focus on cities, because that's where all the population is living, and they're causing the cities, as has been said over and over again in the past 2 days, 80% of energy is consumed in them, 80% of the greenhouse gases are produced by them, 60% of the global population live in them, and blah, blah, blah. So cities is the answer. This is a picture of Amman in 1940s. This is this picture of, same picture, but today. And I don't think there was any concept of where we should be expanding our growth and how we do that. And I think the reason why there's no long-term planning in the process, so there should be, in order to move into a green economy, the principles of a sustainable city must take into all accounts that are mentioned in this presentation. Financing green environment, financing economy, financing culture and society, all have to happen at the same time. You cannot move forward without having everyone on the same page at the same time. Otherwise, it just doesn't work. You need to have the financial system also engaged in green financing. So there are examples I can give you in Jordan, but what we created in Jordan is a platform for the cities to combine their efforts. So we designed a new initiative and called it EcoCities, EcoCities Forum. And for the same reasons I mentioned, we brought together the city planners and managers and mayors and ministers of environment, ministers of planning, and we bring them together together with the private sector to talk about our serious issues about the energy and water and food. And there's so much great ideas coming out of these meetings. And I can give you just some of them. Energy saving sector. Look at this. This, to me, looks like it's a catastrophe to some people. I mean, 30% of efficiency can be made in water pumping. Well, you know, those are all opportunities. Look at this graph. We've done in transportation. This is the brown one. The brown one is what we're doing with a do-nothing approach. We're spending $1.37 billion on transportation. If we save the 20% that we've done, research for, we can actually save 200 million. That 200 million translates into economic projects for the private sector to make money off of. That's where the changes can occur. Well, how do you get the private sector to become mobilized? Well, if they see these numbers and see how much they can be saving by implementing water efficiency techniques and water saving, energy saving, all of these are proposed or possible investments for a green economy that can be very lucrative. So in order for this to happen, you have to have the legislation, and Jordan has gone forward with their renewable energy efficiency, where we have an efficiency and renewable energy law with feed-in tariffs. Why? Because of the reasons that we mentioned, the high sun irradiance that we have wind energy in our part of the world that needs to be taken more advantage of. But there are barriers. The awareness needs to be worked on at the same time with the capacity building, the commercialization, and the incentives and disincentives, how to bring that together. That's been done. Let's not reinvent the wheel, and let's try to get all these changes done at the same time, because it makes sense. It makes sense for the environment, it makes sense for the private sector, and it makes sense for our cities as well, to have these cities. Look at this example of how can we transform an already built structures to become more environmentally friendly, and by doing so, by implementing these, we get the private sector and more economy, driving our economies that are otherwise stagnating into something that's more sustainable. And these are simple tools that we can be using here and there, and it's not something that is just ridiculously expensive or people haven't heard of. So the cities is where we need to be concentrating our work. That's where the sources of all these pollutants are coming from. And I can go on and on about the water for the same reasons. Water is not being tackled in a sustainable manner as well because of the lack of sustainable supply and demand strategies. And of course, the absence of in many cases, the green financing causes the private sector to also be slower in their uptake of these very important situations. There are things that governments can do as well, with central banks becoming more inclined or aware about what they need to do. So banks need to become more aware of their need and their profitability by providing green financing. It's not a non-profit basis. It can be very profitable. And so these are why things we need to be really cognizant of and very vigilant about. So benefits are amazing with their job creation. Mobility, by the way, we are introducing the very first electric car in Jordan. The very first. This is we didn't pay anything. I'm not in the government. All I had to do is bring the private sector together with the municipality, and now they're going to be starting up 10 free of charge charging stations for this electric car, charging from the sun. So we're going to use solar energy to charge our cars, starting out with the municipality so we can get the so that we can get ready with the critical mass that we need to have in order to move forward. So what is my final remark? The secret, there's always going to be challenges, and the secret is never to give up, and to integrate all the necessary economic, legislative, and awareness changes at the same time, and to always make room for the private sector. That if I was to ask how to sum up, that's what we need to do. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Raouf. Well, this was really an activist perspective, never give up, and I think it's important that we have people like you. I would ask you to join us again here on the panel for a last round of questions. I've been asked to finish here at 1:15. So we have like time for some questions and comment. I would suggest that we collect 3 questions. Please be brief, and then last round of answers.
Hi, Tariq Racha, MIT. My question is Professor Yasser. You mentioned a very risky statement about density and vulnerability. One can wonder how density actually leads to a more vulnerable society, because if someone is living outside of the city, for example, with a power outage and no access to a car, they can be put in a very vulnerable situation as well. So resiliency can come from many aspects. Water is one of them, but I would like to ask you to reflect on how density can actually lead to more vulnerability.
So I would say we just collect maybe 3 and then the middle. Yep.
Hi, my question goes to Dr. Farjallah. You mentioned something about food security and about growing our own food in rooftop gardens. I totally agree on this idea, but shouldn't we tackle the more important thing about food security? I mean, we are food insecure in the Arab region, but our problem is not the small commodities that can be planted on rooftops. Our main problem is wheat, actually. So, and to add to that, basically, I would like to highlight the social and economic dimensions of planting our own food. How would that have an impact on the society as a total? Thank you.
Is there another question or comment right now? If not, I would ask you to answer. There's one question for you and for you.
Well, I totally agree with you. I have nothing against density, and I'm very pro-density, but maybe I didn't explain myself clearly. What I basically meant is that when you have a density or concentration of people, infrastructure, and that's the idea of density, is to have more efficiency, more distribution, less cost, and so forth. When you have all of that concentrated in one area, the only thing that I'm trying to say is that when you look at it from a risk perspective, and I agree with you, if you're outside in the periphery and you don't have a car, you're definitely vulnerable. But what I'm trying to say is that the amount of loss in case of let's say, I don't know, sea surge or a wave surge or something like that, which is of a high scale, the amount of loss is very high compared to something else. Now, what I'm trying, to explain myself further, it doesn't mean density does not work. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is that maybe centralized density doesn't work. Maybe we need to be looking at more something that's cluster-based and distributed and so forth. So, and this is, and we're looking at cities from from a sustainability point of view, and density is always never questioned. And this is when we start looking at resilience, you start questioning density. Okay, and it's not questioning it not for the sake of putting it away, because definitely probably the benefits are very high for density. So it's about just looking at it from a different angle and trying to look at it from a different perspective.
If I may interject on one thing here, for density, think of Ebola. Ebola has been prevalent in Africa for ages, and it only took on this large magnitude because it hit a built-up area. It used to hit up smaller villages and on the fringes, and definitely societies or communities were wiped out, but it did not spread that bad, except because of this density of that. But then there are other positives that go with density. So just that point to point out. To answer the question on growing our own food, I am definitely against self-sufficiency. This is something that does not work. I'm starting with your second part. Growing our own food, we don't have the area, especially in Lebanon, but other places we do have that. And we don't have the resources in terms of water and in terms of processing, etc. This we don't have in Lebanon. Some countries do. Syria had it. Sudan has it. To some extent, Iraq has it. So these are countries that can be self-sufficient and even net exporters. But that is beyond the realm of what we're addressing here. But still, you need to look at it in the terms of the balance of how much water am I going to be using to produce how many tons of wheat, burning how much energy, and how could I better optimize this? And then that comes into the equitable nature of the food distribution and food supply. Growing our own food locally, it's not for sustainability, I mean self-sufficiency. You will not ever grow food enough in a parking lot sized area to supply a city. But several of those can invigorate a local economy for production or sale of certain produce, and then you will have that kind of an economy going on a better the cycle of economy can go on. And then if you do this in several areas, and Yasser just spoke about the cluster approach. If you have several clusters of these and many of these, then you might have something that is sort of more enduring and sustainable.
If you wanted to add something?
I just want to caution that rooftop agriculture could work for cities like maybe Lebanon or others that have precipitation throughout the year. But most of the cities in our part of the world barely see rainwater in a sustainable manner, even in wintertime. So you need to be cautious about, taking projects that work in the Europe or the American market and bringing it over, because of certain changes in climate might not allow for things like this to happen. Just be caution.
Are there any other questions, comments? Yes, in the middle. Basil, mic for Basil.
You can speak in two languages.
Exactly. You could even translate your own question to Arabic.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the presentations. Mobile away. Okay, my question and my observation is that with all presentations that we had seen from this morning, is that you have ideas, you have good pictures, you have good ideas about how to make things more environmental and sustainable, but the link between that and making it a reality is missing from this conference. This is my own observation. I'm not a specialist in this area, but for those who talked about walkable areas and bicycle usage, stuff like that, it's okay, it's great. Yani, thank you very much for reflecting on that. And with even talking about green cars and solar cars, it's a great thing, but still, this is done on, if it's done even in Jordan, it's done on a very low scale. The biggest issues, energy, water, solar energy, renewable energy, is not applicable in the Arab world. We still see, Jordan is still dependent on other countries. So how to influence the policies, how to influence the decision makers, how to create this link between thinkers and reality. We need realities, and we need a real solving for all these problems. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil, for this critical but very important question. I think it's the central question, and so I would suggest that we conclude with it. If you have everybody a short answer, and
we'll go this way. It's always easy to lay the blame, and I think we are all responsible. You're responsible for making your change in your own way. We need to be more vocal. Like the speaker before me said, that we need to educate the next generation that's coming up. Education is an important part. But we need to start moving on our own. We've reached the point where the problems that we're facing is affecting our lives. These transportation issues that we heard are serious. So we need to start talking about how I can change. Private sector is important. Talking with your parliamentarian, you do vote, I'm sure, at one point or another. Force that idea into their brain and make it happen.
I mean, there's this Michael Jackson song that starts with a man in the mirror, right? It starts with us, and I second that. It starts with us. You can opt to not buy a 4x4 car. You can opt to walk more. You can opt to do that. That starts. That starts. And if you say it's beyond me, of course, you can start giving up. Not you personally, but as an individual. You can give up and not do anything, and nothing will happen. It will not change. I agree. I totally agree with you. Nothing will change. But it can start, and it has started here. In Lebanon, we've got the Green Building Society with us here in Lebanon. Now everybody is clamoring, all those developers are clamoring to build those buildings that have a LEED certification or BREEAM certification and all that. So it started with one, and that developer advertised that we are the only green building in Lebanon. And then another one popped up, and then, so that started it. And this is where the initiative at the bottom-up approach works. I mean, nobody forced them to do this, and it's individuals that take this on and produce it. So it starts out with little islands that grow out. So this is where it comes in. Then it is also up to our institute. For example, the Issam Ferris Institute, we try and we reach out. We bring you guys, we bring in academia, civil society together, and we can then, we're giving you the opportunity to create a pressure group. And this pressure group, you're not alone. I mean, you've got also the media with you here. So you can start working with that avenue to put in pressure on your decision makers and policy makers. So this is another step. Nothing happens overnight, but it is happening, and you can build up the pressure. Al Gore, when he made his movie about climate change, it was very well received because people started listening to it beforehand. People were prepared. So you need to raise awareness and preparation in that sense, and people will be more receptive. And then by involving in politics and reaching out to politicians, you are able to influence at least one out of, in Lebanon, the 128 that we have. And then one by one, it can turn and make a difference. In Lebanon, we had sort of successfully stopped smoking in restaurants. And it did not start from the bottom, from the top. It started at the American University of Beirut, reaching out to a civil society, and they reached out to decision makers, and it worked. So this is something that does work. It's not beyond us, and it's not beyond our time either. I'm an eternal optimist, by the way. So
I'm not sure how much I can add to this, but there's one point I wanted to mention, but I ran out of time beforehand. I think one main problem, I mean, I completely agree that, yes, there aren't solutions here. I also completely agree with what's been said. I think we have a problem of governance in the Middle East, and that's our biggest problem. How to change that, the bottom up is very important. I completely agree. It is extremely important. But this also needs to be matched with a top-down also initiative, and awareness needs to be at the higher level. How do you do that? How you change that? Incrementally, it has to be one way or another. So that's one. And then I have another point. How do we change all of this? I mean, we've been surviving in this situation in this part of the world for thousands of years, and there is some indigenous knowledge. We are just so good about copying. We just take things and we plump them in our areas, and we just do that. That's one thing I'm trying to work on right now, is to try and look at, for example, in Lebanon, there's a big tradition in Lebanese villages about collecting water and this whole system. And so it's trying to understand, the Bedouins have been living in the desert for how many ages, how many millennia? And why can't we understand how these people work, understand how they do that, and then transfer that to our very contextual way of doing things? So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I'm not sure there's an answer. But just adding to the point. I think there's one more.
Yeah, there's one more question, and I realized that we still have 10 minutes. So perfect. Thanks here. The lady in the middle, if you could have a mic.
Mic disappears.
A last question, yeah.
Trying to stop us from talking.
They want us to
Yeah. Quick. But I realized in the program it's 1:30, so.
Yes, hello, good afternoon. It's not a question, I just want to make a comment. A few weeks ago, I was in Jordan for a conference on eco-cities, And actually, I was very impressed with what the Jordanian governments are doing, especially the municipality of Amman. And I remember one of the projects was mentioned, which is trash for cash, whereby they're actually generating energy from their trash. And they really are, I mean, doing amazing projects. And so, no, there is change happening. And irrespective of the situation, political situation, I think the need, the financial need of countries are pushing them to go into more green issues.
Actually, I think the best thing that could have ever happened to the environmentalists is the raising cost of energy, because it's forcing them to become more economically aware. And so that's where all this stuff is coming from. I don't want to take up too much time, but thank you very much for bringing up Jordan.
شكرا عبد اللطيف البركي من المغرب. أريد فقط أن أتحدث عن تجربة المغرب في هذا المجال، في مجال الطاقة المتجددة. المغرب دخل في بالفعل المشكل مطروح كما ترك الأخ من قبل حول إمكانيات المحدودة لهذه الطاقات، ولكن على العموم البداية دائما مفيدة. المغرب دخل في تجربة بناء محطة لتوليد الطاقة الشمسية في الجنوب الشرقي للمغرب، بالتحديد في مدينة ورزازات، وهي من أكبر المحطات في العالم، بحيث أنها طاقتها الإنتاجية ستكون 2000 ميجاوات، وستبدأ الوحدة الأولى في الإنتاج خلال سنة 2015 بإنتاج حوالي 60 ميجاوات. طبعا لن تفي كل حاجيات المغرب، ولكنها مبادرة جيدة. في نفس المجال هناك برنامج طموح فيما يخص مجال الطاقة الريحية، سواء في شمال المغرب أو في جنوب المغرب، وهناك بناء عدة محطات لإنتاج الطاقة الريحية. إذن أعتقد أنه الإمكانيات موجودة في العالم العربي، يجب فقط أن تكون الإرادة السياسية لبدء هذا المشروع، وإن كان لا يفي بالكامل، ولكن فإنه إيجابي على كل حال. شكرا.
Thank you for this comment. I don't know if you want to add something. Well, I think it's very important that we have these kind of meetings, these regional conferences, and then, well, the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation sees itself as a platform for dialogue, and I think this is very important that we have these kind of exchanges to stress the positive examples.
And I'd like to thank you. I haven't done that, but thank Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung inviting us to bring this forward. I think it's a very important time, and also Issam.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, well then, the only thing I wanted to say is bon appétit. Enjoy your meal and have a good break. And we'll see each other in 1 hour at 2:30.
Back here.
Bye bye. Back here. Yeah.